Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a great introduction, but nevertheless, my second slide still says I'm going to talk about myself. Anyway, so yeah, who am I? I'm Robin-Yann Storm. I used to work at indie studios on games for console and PC. I did that for a few years. Then I was a co-founder for an indie studio for a little while. Then I did a bunch of freelancing and consulting as a tool designer. Then, yeah, I worked in AAA industry as a tool designer at IO Interactive. Then did that at Guerrilla Games as well in Amsterdam. And then I did a few years working at Apple in both Amsterdam and later in California. And then after that, I went back to being a workflow consultant and freelance tool UX designer. So, the faults of sensible defaults, what does that really mean? It's important that this is more about tool UX and UI than it is about engineering. Like, engineering is important to this, but it's about making sure that the tool UX and UI is good because of the engineering that we're doing. And it's about the well-being of your users. Like, are your users happy with the tools that you have? And also, it's about the quality and speed of your tools. It's very much about being able to make the right amount of content in the time that you have and being able to focus on the things that you really need to be able to make things happen. So, for example, let's take a look at some of those things, for example, in Unity. This is Unity, and we have a bunch of sections, as we usually kind of would expect them from many different tools. And so in this case, we can kind of divide them up in a few sections like this. So a couple of different sections, and basically they're the hierarchy, they're the toolbar, the 3D view, the property panel, and the asset browser. Like most 3D engines, we can kind of see like having these kinds of things, we think, right? But now let's take a look at Unreal. Unreal Engine 5 especially is very different. It's a lot cleaner now. They've like made things a lot less like visible initially. But generally, we still have the same kind of systems. We have toolbar. Now the hierarchy is on the right side. Property panels there, and we have 3D view, and the asset browser nowadays is hidden. You have to actually click on it and then make the asset browser appear, which they changed. Now let's take a look at 3ds Max. Very similar, right? We have a couple of sections over here. Hierarchy is back on the left now. We have a bunch of toolbars, property panels, 3D view, okay. Let's take a look at Maya. Very similar again. We have lots of sections. In this case, they have a lot of toolbars. Like, they have a lot of toolbars, kind of all over the place, which not a bad thing. It's just interesting to see that they're, again, a little bit different. And let's take a look at, the kind of the new kid on the block, the one that's very up and coming, doing a lot of really cool stuff, is Blender, of course. And Blender changing things up again. Now the hierarchy is back on the right side. We have a bunch of toolbars over here, a bunch of toolbars over there, property panel, 3D view, no asset browser in this case. But again, we can see through all these bits of UI that, they're all different. So those are what people would say are the sensible defaults, right? Like, they're the ones that you would see every single time. But if you even see in the screenshots just now, they're all changing things all over the place. Some have toolbars at the top, some have them at the side, some have the hierarchy left, some have the hierarchy right. All these things are constantly different. So it's this question of what is shown by default. And it really kind of changes for every single UI that we're using. Like, are those defaults really like sensible every single time? No. They can never really truly be sensible. They never can be sensible in the degree of like, oh, they're always good, we can always do. Like, there is no singular, amazing, always good and must-have default. Like, oh, the hierarchy has to be here, or the hierarchy has to be there, or the toolbar has to be here, or the asset browser has to be there. They're constantly changing all over the place. And usually what I see is, depending on what you've used before in previous years, that makes you kind of go like, oh, that's the default. Of course, you need to do it that way. But if someone else is using your tool and they're used to a different kind of UI, that completely doesn't match up. Now, in a lot of cases, what I especially hear engineers say is like, well, if you set things up in a certain way, and then you're, letting the user set things up, well, then you're failing to make a decision and pushing the decision on the user. That's not really always correct. It's important to think about like why is that being said? Like, are there other examples that we can see now where this kind of phrase isn't correct at all? Now, instead, allowing the tools to be shaped by the user is very, very powerful because it allows everyone to do the work that they need to do when they need to do it. And we'll go through a lot of examples to showcase why that's the case. Now, you're probably thinking of two things when I'm talking about this. One, you're thinking, yes, I know that. How do I convince my manager that it's true? Like, I would like to edit my tools, set things up. How do I convince my manager? Or you're thinking, you're totally wrong. What are you talking about? And that's fair as well. Get that a lot. That's fine. So let's answer both of these questions in one go. Like, how can we prove these things? How can we show that making your tools editable is a really good thing? And to talk about, first I have to talk about The End of Average. It's a 2016 book by Todd Rose. And in it, he talks about one particular story that I like a lot, which I'll give to you here, which is in the 1940s, the US Air Force was having a lot of trouble with the airplanes. They were crashing all the time, they were having a lot of issues, swerving, a lot of issues. So what were they thinking? Well, pilots were having a lot of trouble. Okay, so what's the solution in this particular case? Of course, the idea always brought up is like, oh, it's pilot error, right? Like, it's user error. The user must be doing something wrong, and that's why everyone is crashing and having issues. But like, really, every single pilot? Like, that many pilots all having issues? That's not really reasonable. Something else is going on. But there was also no mechanical or electronic failure. Like, these planes were totally fine, and still they were having issues. So what could be going on? So they figured out maybe it's a design somewhere. Maybe it's the design of the cockpit. Okay, so they figured out, like, what is this cockpit actually designed for? Well, it was made for measurements from 1926. They measured all the pilots in 1926, they averaged it down, and they were like, that's the cockpit. That's the cockpit that everyone's supposed to be using. And it didn't work out at all anymore. So what were they thinking? Well, let's measure them all again, right? Let's just measure in 1945, and they just figured out, like, what's going on, how can we fix these kinds of things? So they measured thousands and thousands of pilots, and then they averaged it down. But who actually fit that average? Not a single one. Like, none of them fit the true average. If you measure like 1,000 people, none of them is going to fit the exact average. There's not going to be this perfect human being that's going to fit exactly all these things that you have. And we can take a look at that. Like, let's take a look at a bunch of body parts and whether they're, like, bigger or smaller in size. So in this case, pilot one might have a smaller head, smaller shoulders, smaller chest, but larger arms, smaller waist, bigger legs, and smaller feet. Totally fine, they're able to get around, it's totally great. Pilot 2 might be very different. They might have a lot of larger head, larger shoulders, larger chest, smaller arms, bigger waists, smaller legs, and bigger feet. So what's the average pilot in this case? It's this one, which neither of them fit. So if you're going to make a cockpit that fits exactly to the average, both of them are going to be unhappy. Now, I know at this point you're probably thinking, like, well, this is very different from this, and this is very different from this, but like, it's mirrored, so of course, yeah, easy average, nice job, Storm, but like, fine, you got me, I get it, let's move them around. Like, no matter where we put them, no matter what kind of measurements we end up with, the average still doesn't fit. Pilot 1 is still going to have issues here, and Pilot 2 is still going to have issues over here. So no matter what kind of averaging we end up with, whether it's mirrored really nicely or not, doesn't matter, we're still going to have these issues where pilots are going to have trouble. So there's no such thing as an average pilot, and when something is designed for the average, it usually means it's fit for nobody. And this is especially the case for really complex, specialized tools. Like a door, yeah, sure, anyone can kind of like touch a door, push a door, there's some accessibility there, but it generally works. But a cockpit with this many buttons and things that you gotta do continually, that's a very different story. So the idea was to make it adjustable, and that's what they did. They made the cockpit adjustable. So in this case, they adjust the seat for leg length, they adjust the controls for arm length, and what happened in this case? Pilot performance soared. Everything ended up going much, much better. So in this particular case, you need to let the cockpit adjust to the pilot. So in this case, instead of the pilot having to adjust, you have a pilot setting, and you set it this way for pilot 1, and you set it this way for pilot 2, and then which one is in the cockpit, that one is what works really well for them. So there's no such thing as a sensible default. There's no default that can please everyone. Not everyone. A bunch, sure, but not everyone. And having defaults be rigid really here is the problem. Like, I'm not saying you need to have no defaults. There's always a default. There's an original setting somewhere. But don't think into too much as sensible. Don't think about it like, oh, we've done this, and now it's fine, because we average down that most people kind of do it this way. That doesn't really work out well. So your users also, in a lot of cases, know what they need to do and how they need to do it, especially when it comes to really complex professional tools. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking, sure, but I'm not a pilot, I'm a game developer. Except for a rare few of you who are game developers and pilots. So sometimes I get one of you, but in this case, except for a rare few of you, this is usually the case. So all right, so what is the cockpit of a game developer? Like, what do you do? How do you do your work? Well, let's think back to the human being in this case. What does your cockpit look like? It's your physical space, and it's your digital space. So let's take a look at those. Let's look at your physical space first. So, what do you adjust in your physical space? Like, what is something that you change? Your chair. How high is it? Where are the armrests? How far does the back go? How far is it from the desk? Is it soft or hard? Does it roll or not? these are really big and important decisions for you, right? Like you had to make this decision once, and when you originally got the chair, you then adjusted it for your kind of leg length, how you are comfortable, and now you're sitting great. It's a one-time adjustment, but it's a really important adjustment. You just didn't stick with the defaults of the chair as it came. If you would, you'd have a lot of back problems, a lot of arm problems, you might even get RSI. Like it's a very big deal that you were able to adjust it. It was super important that you were able to do that. Now, what's another thing? Like in this case, would you say towards that chair, like you are failing to make a decision and pushing the decision on the user? Like you give someone a chair and they can adjust it, you're like, well, that chair must be bad, you're adjusting it. Like it's ridiculous, right? Like of course you're adjusting it, it's very important. So another thing would, for example, be your desk. Like how high is it? Can you adjust it up and down? How is it like L-shaped or is it like very large, you need a lot of space? Like how do you set that up? Very important for how you did things. You adjusted that properly. Another one is your screen. How big is it? What's the resolution? Do you have that Flux app on it, so like the blue light becomes less after dark? Like there's a lot of adjustment that you've also made on the screen that is important for you to do. Also your keyboard. There's a bunch of people who have a numpad, and then there's people who really don't want to have a numpad. And that's totally fine. Like some people don't want to have a numpad, that's okay, but you made that decision, it's important for you. And also, some of you also like have the keyboard that's like angled like this, and it's like very ergonomic, and it's like, that's great for you, but you made that decision, right? Like you had to do that. If you didn't do that, and you had to work for like 8 hours a day, you'd be in pain. It's a terrible thing, right? You made a choice, and that choice is important. We can't just make a keyboard that fits everyone. Same with your mouse. There's some people who really love those MMO mouses with like 10 buttons on it. I can't do that. I love just having the 2 buttons and just like the click, that's totally fine. But some people really love that, and they're able to work so fast with it. Like they're so good at having the exact thing accessible at any moment. It's incredibly important for them. So this is all incredible, like really interesting stuff that you're constantly doing in your daily life, and yet you can't adjust your tools? Isn't that crazy when your tools aren't adjustable? Like how frustrating that is and how terrible it is, just because you're thinking like, oh, sensible faults, you'll be fine, whatever it is, that thing that we have. So what is in a cooperative game developer? You know, thinking back to the human being, it's your chair, your screen, your desk, your keyboard, your mouse. What is the binding principle between all these things? It's you. It all depends on you. You are unique. In the way that you are shaped and the way that you do your work, you are also unique. In fact, your job is probably unique. And there's many factors involved here. There's like things like your studio, your country, your manager, your tools, your culture, your skills. For example, like when you talk to people nowadays, especially about level design, as a level designer, do you do environment art as well? Or do you not? Do you do scripting as well? Or do you not? Depending on which studio you're talking to, what doing level design means is a completely different thing. It can depend very largely. So let's take a look at that. What kind of level designer are you? Like let's take a look at a bunch of things that we might have to do for level design and whether we need to do those less or more. So level designer 1 might have to do not a lot of geometry, not a lot of materials, but a lot of narrative work. They do a lot of narrative scripting. Okay, makes sense. Not a lot of combat, but they have to do a lot of 3D art, not a lot of lighting, and not a lot of scripting. Well, another level designer might be, doing a lot of geometry work, a lot of material work, not a lot of narrative work, but a lot of combat stuff. They're really good at that. Not a lot of 3D art, but a lot of lighting and a lot of scripting. So in this case, what is the average level designer? It's this one. But of course, as we saw earlier, there is no such thing as an average level designer. Everyone's slightly different in the work that they do. So there's no sensible default. There is a default. Sure, but don't think of them too hard as sensible. It's very easy to think about, oh, sensible defaults, that's fine, and we'll just leave it as is. No, let the people adjust these things. Like averaging out can be disastrous when we're thinking about these defaults. So don't think of them as sensible defaults. Instead, think of them as editable defaults. Can I edit this thing? Can I change this thing? If I give this to someone, can they change it to do the thing that they need to do? Again, thinking back to your chair, your keyboard, your mouse, thinking about the changes that you made. Now let's take a look at the digital space. We've looked at the physical space. Let's take a look at the digital space. Like, what do you adjust there? And a bunch of tools do some interesting things here. Like, let's take a look, for example, at Unity. Unity, there's a menu here. I can just add or remove all these overlays. I can change all these things. I can change what is visible. And I can also drag them around and put them in various different places. And I can do that with a lot of different of the toolbars. Like I can just move them around and set them to places where I might need to use them depending on what kind of level designer I am. I can also move windows around, which of course is a much more regular thing nowadays. And also I can save layouts and go back to those layouts very quickly. I can even share those layouts with other people if I wanted to. And I can also go to like preferences here and find my hotkeys and have a nice visual list of all the hotkeys that I have and adjust them and change them in ways that would work better for me and are easier for me to do that work with, right? Now, let's take a look at Unreal. In Unreal, again, we have a bunch of those toolbars and overlays kind of at the top. And I can even turn on this FPS counter over here, which is an interesting thing. But I can't like drag them off. I can't like quickly drag them and put them in another place. I can, however, turn off all the overlays. That's possible. But now I can no longer turn off the FPS counter. The button's gone. Anyway, so I have to turn the thing back on, then turn off the FPS counter, and then it's gone again. So it's a little bit strange of like how that's set up. But the ghosting that they have when you come to like dragging a window around, that's so neat. Like you can see where the window is going to go before you let go. Really important that you can easily adjust these kinds of things. Like it's very much nicer to do because you know what is going to happen. And also like there's more other menus and stuff like that. There's a lot of buttons I can find all over the place, but I can't just like drag them off and like make a toolbar. Like what are the things that I use often as a level designer depending on my skill set? I want to use those. Can't do that. Like sure, it's possible to put buttons on there, but it's a much more convoluted process instead of just very simple. And when we take a look at the hotkey list, this is the hotkey list of like being able to edit those. It's a really big list. It's just a giant, like there's no visual overview, there's no idea of like what is being used where, there's just a giant list that you have to search through to find out the things you have to do. So we can tell the difference here. This is much more difficult to use and much harder to adjust, right? Another great example is Keynote on macOS. So I can right-click the toolbar, and here's all the toolbar functions that I want to use. And I can just drag them on, and I've changed the toolbar. And I can drag them off, a little poof even, when they disappear, which I think is really great. I'll be honest, I worked at Apple, I did not work at this. This happened long before I ever worked there, I want to be honest about that. So yeah, you can also like, drag on a default. There is a default, but you can change it so readily. Like there is a default, sure, but like just change it, like set up, do the thing that you want to do depending on the stuff that you often do when you make a keynote presentation. You can make those changes easily. Another one, of course, is also Blender. In this case, in Blender, we have a lot of workspaces. Like there's a lot of different places with a lot of different UI, depending on the work that you need to do. You can also make your own ones and set things up in various ways, which is very interesting and neat. There's a lot of buttons all over the place. I can't drag them off and just like make a toolbar really quick. Like that's not quite possible. But you have this quick favorites menu, which I think is very neat because you can go to any menu here, right click, add to quick favorites, right click, add to quick favorites. Even over here, I can right click, add to quick favorites. And now open up the quick favorites and there's all the options that I've selected. So in any menu, I can kind of go around and just click on things, add this to the right-click menu that I want to use in this case, and there, I can just easily set things up. Like I, as a user, am able to set things up in the way that I need, depending on the skill set, studio, and place that I am in. So another one, of course, is Maya. Maya has shelves. Like if you used Maya, you've used shelves. You've probably seen this a bunch. Like there's a bunch of different shelves with all kinds of different functionality that, depending on the task that you have, is important. Like rigging, animation, rendering, effects. It all depends on what you want to do. The neat thing is you can also create your own one. So I've created a brand new one, and I shift-click, and I just, again, add options to it. I go through the menus, and it's like, what are the things that I want to do? I want to do a little bit of editing this, a little bit editing that, a little bit this, a little bit that, and set up the toolbar, set up the functions that I want to access quickly depending on the role that I have. Maybe I'm a lighting artist, maybe I'm a material artist, maybe I make geometry. These things change, right? So being able to set those things up yourself is really important for people to work efficiently and fast because they all have slightly different jobs. And the thing is, the Maya shelf is a really important thing because if you're working in AAA, you probably have one. Like whenever I visit studios that use Maya, I see a Maya shelf. It happens a bunch. And the thing is, it was probably made by a tech artist like 15 years ago. And it has been shared with everyone else, like everyone's using that Maya shelf. And now every single artist uses it. Like it's very, very important. It's recommended to everyone who's hired, like, oh, you're hired, you're going to do work in Maya, here's the shelf, please use this shelf. Everyone's using this shelf. It's critical for the pipeline. It happens a bunch, like a single script on that shelf breaks or something breaks on that shelf, and suddenly the whole pipeline shuts down. You can't get art into the engine anymore, like it happens a lot. But you know what? The tech artist who built it, he doesn't even work there anymore. Like, if you're working in AAA, you have one of these. It happens all over the place. I see it. And doesn't that show you how important it is to have that tool be editable? to show that you can set up these things in ways that then everyone in the company can use, and it's powerful and nice and good to use, and how much it helps the studio and the pipeline. Now, of course, toolbars are not the main subject in tool UX design. They're just a nice example. Like, I'm just using it here as an example. There's plenty of other things, but toolbars are just a neat example. So adjusting to your needs really is the key here. Like, you're going to be working in this tool for 8+ hours a day for 4 years straight, maybe even more if you're working in AAA. Like, you're going to be spending so much time in this. Do you really want it to be painful, or do you want it to be easy to use? So it's questions like, what is on the toolbar? What's in the drop-downs? Which panels are visible? Do I have workspaces? Are my workflows clear? And it basically is what I need where I need it. Can I easily access the things that I need for my role? Whether it's a level designer, an artist, a scripter, can I access the things I need quickly? So it's also important to not think per tool, but think per workflow. Because let's say, for example, we go back to a bunch of things that we need to do, right? Let's say that we have workflow needs where a particular person at a company, even just undefined with a role, maybe you're indie, so you have to do a lot of different things. Great. So let's say in the case you need to block out a combat area. Okay, what would that need to do, right? So a lot of geometry work, because you got to block it out, sure. Not a lot of material work, we're white boxing it, gray boxing it, don't need materials yet, that's fine. No narrative, it's just we're blocking it out, it's fine. A lot of combat stuff, though, and maybe some scripting we have to do, some spawn placements, NPC stuff like that. No 3D art, we're blocking it out, that's fine. Little bit of lighting work, we got to show the player where the good and bad areas are, like a little bit of lighting is important. And we got to do a bunch of scripting to make sure the combat works. Okay, great. So you've finished that, everything's great, people are happy with it. What happens next? Well, what if I want to polish this combat area? Like, we finished it, now we got to make it look even better. So how do things change? Things change a bunch. You might have to not to do a lot of geometry work now, but you have to do a lot of material work all of a sudden. Not a lot of narrative work still, but still a bunch of combat work and a lot more 3D art and a lot more lighting work, right? It's the same area you're working in, but depending on the thing that you have to do, the things that you have to do are very, very different. Now, of course, at this point, a creative director comes in and kind of goes, hey, this is great, but we want like an NPC to like appear at the end of combat and like talk to you and do a whole bunch of stuff. Okay, so what if a friendly NPC gets added after combat? Again, everything changes. Now we got to do a lot more geometry work, make sure the NPC doesn't get stuck, because they get stuck a lot, or they fall through the floor. It happens a lot. We don't need to do a lot of material work. It's not important for the NPC. We have to do a bunch of narrative work, though. The NPC's got to talk to you, they got to walk to you, it's important. A little bit of combat work to make sure they don't get killed, also very important. A bunch of 3D art, still got to make sure that it looks right and looks proper for that NPC. Not a lot of lighting work, but a bunch of scripting work, right? So even with one area, with the work that you're doing staggered over it over time, there's a lot of different things that you do. So don't think per tool in this case, think per the workflow that you're trying to do. Because if you think of something like the geometry tool and the shader graph, the scripting tool, the terrain tool, the lighting tools, and the dialogue tools, you can make it very easy and simple for yourself to look at all these tools as all these separate things of like, oh, they're all being built separately, they're all being like edited separately, they're all separate things, but they're not. When someone is actually doing work, these things overlap continually. They're constantly overlapping. Like, this might be the combat workflow, where you use a little bit of each. You're not using the full tool, you're just doing a little bit of this tool, a little bit of that tool to make that combat area. Or the narrative workflow might be over here, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Or you might have to use the cinematics workflow. Again, there's a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Like, don't think about these things as this tool does this tool does that. Think about how these tools are combined and used in various ways to achieve the goals that are necessary. And also, like gray boxing workflow in this case, it might not use any of those other tools, and that's totally fine. But when people are starting to work on other areas again, well, it might be necessary. But in this case, it's good to think about not just per tool, but like, what's the workflow that someone is trying to achieve? They're using one tool and another tool together. How does that work? You don't need to just have the single tool work, but all these tools work together. So what are solutions in this case? Like, what can we do with this? Like, we want to make things adjustable, thinking about workflow. So like, it's making the defaults adjustable. Depending on what the person wants to do, have them move that toolbar, have them move that function. Oh, this tool has a particular button. I want to use that in this other workflow. Let's let me put it over there so I can easily use that. Like, allow users to set up their own workflows if they can. Sure, there's a lot of folks that you might think of as like, well, I don't really want people to touch things. But like, if you're working with people who are working 8+ hours a day for 4+ years in these tools. They're experts at what they do, right? Like they know what they want, right? They know what's important for how they're working. They're constantly engaging with it. And also allow users to be creative. Like we're in a creative industry, especially just anything with 3D, but especially in games. We're constantly doing creative things. Allow users to be creative, to set things up in ways that work better for them. And look at what other tools allow to be adjusted. Like I showed a couple examples earlier. There's way more examples out there. Like look at how many other things are actually adjustable. And don't force your users into uncomfortable workflows. Like especially when you force them into uncomfortable workflows, they're going to be deeply unhappy. And don't just think of defaults as sensible. Don't think of defaults as sensible. Have a default, but not just constantly sensible. Now at this point, you're probably thinking, yes, but if I give a user the ability to just place stuff all over the place and place toolbars and buttons all over the place, I mean, if I can access everything I need all the time, doesn't that mean I have a very busy and complex interface? Like, wouldn't a user like put stuff all over the place? They might. Have you ever seen a person in World of Warcraft raid on a really high level? I can't even see the boss. They're just covered in UI, and you know what? They are world first. Like they're doing the most amazing thing. No one's done it before, and they're making it happen. It's like it's really not that bad. Like if you look at something like Blender, for example. There's so much stuff going on. There's so many buttons and so many things. And yes, I don't know what most of this means. And I don't know how to use most of that, all these buttons all together. But you know what? If a professional does, and they're good with working at it, and they're happy about it, then I don't care. Are you happy with your work? Are you able to achieve the thing that you need to do? Great. Doesn't matter that it looks like a cockpit. And a really important thing here is that sometimes it's a good thing. Like, for example, the Unreal Engine 4 used to look like this, right? We had a lot of buttons all over the place. A lot of things were sort of like displayed continually. In Unreal Engine 5, they cleaned it up, right? It's a lot less stuff being visible now. But in that case, is that really a good thing? Like, for new users who are coming in and have no idea what they're doing yet, sure. They're much less overwhelmed. It makes sense for them. But for the experts who have been working for it for years and years, who know exactly the things that they want to access, when they want to access it, not that great for them. I've seen a bunch of people complain about the thing. It's like, I just want to access the stuff that I always access. I know what I'm doing. Let me be free. So to talk about it a little bit more, we have to talk about airplanes. Again. So let's talk a little bit more airplanes, because that's really the thing that always comes up, is this cockpit idea of like, oh, there's a cockpit, there's buttons everywhere. How do I know what to do? How do I know what to touch? And yes, I agree with you. If you're not used to this setup, and you're put into place, you're probably going to crash the plane. I agree. It's going to be very, very difficult. But at the same time, if you're a professional and you know how all these things work and you know when to use, what to use, and how those things work, this is a highly professional environment. You know what to use. You know what's quickly accessible. If there's an emergency, you can quickly tap exactly the thing. You don't have to open up a menu, and then a sub-menu, and then a sub-menu, and then a sub-menu. It's like all the buttons are there. If you look at it, sure, it's very confusing. But for the professional who's doing it every single day, it's much better. I'm not going to say it's perfect, but it's a lot better, right? It works out fine. And in this case, even if we switch between airplanes, it's going to be very difficult for us to still get used to it. Like if we're switching from like an Airbus to a Boeing, that UI, those buttons are going to be slightly different. It's going to take some training to do that, right? In the case of pilots, we're talking hours and hours and hours of training. Like you're not going to be put into this seat until you've shown in a simulator that you can do it properly, that you know what you're doing, that you know how it works. So yes, it's very complex, but it works out really well at the end. And the weird thing is that in the games industry especially, there's so many tools that we're constantly switching between. Like there's Unity, there's Blender, there's Miro, there's Jira, there's Confluence, there's ShotGrid. There's all these different pieces of UI that we're constantly being asked to switch between, like constantly. And it's treated as like it's just the most normal thing in the world, and all their UIs are different, and people get confused between them. You know that thing that's probably happened to you where like you went on vacation, and then 2 or 3 weeks you came back, and you're like, oh, I have no idea how these things work anymore, because all these UIs are different. Like it happens to professionals. Like imagine if these UIs were adjustable, so you could set things up in a way that you know how this works, you know what to find quickly, make them similar to each other. It becomes much more easier to work with these things, right? Like that's very important for your like just ability to work. So in this case, you know, cockpits are not necessarily bad if users can effectively use them. right? Like if they fit the exact needs, if they can find everything, if they are adjustable, if they can make them, their own workflow, if the visualization is for them, if they understand it, and if they can work well and accomplish their tasks. That's really the most important thing. If you're looking at a tool, you're like, what the hell is this? But a professional is able to achieve their job very quickly, then cool, awesome. As long as you don't have to work in it, works out great, it works for them. So there's no such thing as a sensible default. Don't think of sensible defaults, just as editable defaults. And whenever someone says this thing of like, well, you're failing to make a decision, like you need to make a decision about how this works, and if you don't, then you're failing it, and you're putting the decision on the user, it's a terrible thing. It's not always correct. And much more important, the original quote is way different. I'm going to read this out. Every time you provide an option, you're asking the user to make a decision. That means they will have to think about something and decide about it. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but in general, you should always try to minimize the number of decisions that people have to make. And that's Joel Spolsky. That's correct, sure. You don't want to like constantly barrage them with decisions. But again, when you got that chair, when you got that desk, you adjusted it once, and then you were done with decisions. But those initial decisions were really, really important. And also it's important that there's a difference between basic UX and complex UX. Like a basic flight booking app is way different from a complex game development tool. See, a lot of people kind of like picking up a UX book from like, the 2000s and kind of going, oh, websites are built this way. We're going to build our tools the same way. It's like, no, it's different. Don't just like take that one-on-one just that easily. Like a flight booking app is used a few times for short bursts, right? Like you want to book a flight, you specifically know what you want to do, so you're going to do that. So the goal of the flight app booking is incredibly clear. You know exactly what you're going to do when you open up that app. And it needs to facilitate a very few particular needs. They're very particular, but they're very few. You know exactly what you want to do in that case. In a complex game development tool, like you're going to use that for 8+ hours a day, for 4+ years straight. You're constantly going to have it open. And the goal of the tool is creativity, which is unbounded. It changes continually. It's uncertain. Like, what's going to happen? What do I need to do? Am I going to do this now or this now? You're going to be experimenting with things. You don't know the end goal sometimes, and that's fine. And it needs to facilitate huge amounts of widely ranging needs, as we saw, like level designers, artists. There's so many different people who do so many different things. So we can't just like look at these things and kind of like easily go like, oh, websites are built this way, and so game development tools as well. I mean, sure, there are things that are similar, like green is good, red is bad. Sure, there's things we can learn from that, but they are very different. If you want to know way more about that, because I don't have this much time over here, please read Interaction Design by Complex Problem Solving by Barbara Mirrell. It's like a book from 2006. It's a very old book. I haven't seen a lot of people who've read it, but like she goes over a lot of examples like this. Also, I will have the books on the final slide as well if you want to take a picture over there to remember these books. And also, another one, of course, very important is please read Designing the User Experience of Game Development Tools by David Lightbound. The title of the book is very on the nose. It's exactly that. It's a great book. Highly recommend reading it. So we're almost at the end, but we need to mention some of the usual responses to this presentation. And those are accessibility, time and money, and prioritizing features. Because usually what here at this point is like, like even something as small as the gizmo can have editable defaults. Like there's small things that can be editable. For example, here in Maya, we can look at the gizmo. We can make those arrows much bigger or smaller. Like all these axes are much easier to use depending on if we make them bigger or smaller. And the same thing goes also for the width. We can change that too. We can make them much bigger and much smaller. And this might remind you of something that we're already doing with games much, much more nowadays. For example, The Last of Us Part 2, we had a huge amount of accessibility options, and they're really wide-ranging, and they're very in-depth. And what they found out with their metrics is that a lot of people are using them, like all over the place, and it's very important for them. So adjustability is also great for accessibility. Like you can adjust things, and it makes it also easier for a lot of other people to use them. Well, what I usually hear at that point is like, but nobody at our company needs that. Nobody needs like adjustability, accessibility. Don't make me talk about airplanes again. Again. Specifically this one. Survivorship bias. It's like, oh, you have nobody at your company who needs adjustable tools? I wonder why that is. Maybe it's because you don't have adjustable tools. Like, it's very much this case of like, yeah, people aren't going to be working with you if they can't work with the tools. It's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem, but it's up to you to solve that if you want to have these really great, awesome people who can do awesome work. So another one that I often hear is editability and accessibility. It costs time and money. True. Can't deny it. It costs time and money, absolutely does. Can also save a lot of money, which is often not mentioned, which is a little bit strange. Like this is a slide from 2010, GDC 2010. Jim Brown gave a talk, and he mentioned the Phillips effect in it, like 2.4 minute savings a day, times 100 employees, 240 minutes a day, equals 4 hours a day. 4 hours a day is 20 hours a week. 20 hours a week over 6 man-months of your time is like 1 year. It's 1 year of your time on the project. It's like if you have a lot of people working your tools, like a lot of people, even a small bit of savings can save so much time for so many people. So yes, it costs time and money to make things adjustable, but the gains of it are also incredible. Always weigh them out. If you're doing a lot of work and getting very little gains, sure, don't do it. But if you can do a bunch of adjustability and get huge gains, why aren't you doing it? That's much more important. And the last one I always hear is, well, you can't argue adjustability is a high priority because it technically isn't a blocker, so we won't build it. So I hear that a bunch. And if someone says that, then your product team is measuring priority in the wrong way. It's like it's really that simple. Like if you argue this for UX and UI, sure, let's take it to the logical extreme. Let's argue this for programming. You know, you don't need any adjustability for programming, right? Like if it's not a blocker, we shouldn't do the work. Great, so let the programmers use assembly. Technically, they don't need anything else, right? And they don't need Visual Studio, Git, Writer, or C++. I mean, they could, with a console and assembly, technically make anything. So is there really a blocker if we give them Visual Studio? Also, they can technically work without any of those, so they aren't blockers, right? Like, it's ridiculous, right? Of course they need Visual Studio, they need Writer, and they need C++. That makes them work much better, more efficient. Same goes for designers, artists. It's the same thing. Make good tools for them. They'll work much more efficiently. Now, there are some other issues of suboptimal tooling, like, for example, longer training times. Like, if you get people into your studio, how long does it take for them to get good at the tool? If you allow things to be adjustable and more nicer for them to use, that works out. And also, more mental overhead and less creativity. If you're constantly fighting the tool, it becomes much harder to be creative and do really awesome and good work. And of course, unhappy people and churn. Like, you've probably heard of people who've literally just like left the studio because the tooling was so bad and terrible to use. They were just like, I'm just not having a good time here. This just sucks. I want to work someplace else. I want to work with something that I do know or something that is much easier to use. So talk a little bit more about that. We have to, okay, we got to get to the end. So I'm going to wrap it up. So removing defaults of sensible defaults, what does that mean? It means defaults are necessary, but don't think of them as sensible too much. Like, try and do something that makes a little, it's a little bit okay, but don't think of it like, this is sensible, this is what we're doing, this works for everyone. It doesn't work that way. And treat defaults as temporary. Don't rely on them always being the same. There's this really big thing that, especially in Blender, which I think is a bit of a shame. In Blender, if they've changed, it was a little bit ago, but like that right click used to be select, and that was the thing that they always used. They changed it now, so now you can do left click. You can change to industry standard hotkeys. Awesome, it's great, really cool to see. If you go to their documentation, they only show the Blender hotkeys. So if you then try and use Blender with the adjustable hotkeys, you don't know what to touch anymore. So it kind of defeats the purpose of having all the documentation and that adjustability. So make sure that you don't rely on those defaults to always be the same. And give the users the power to easily edit those defaults. Like I showed, like simply clicking and dragging. Not going through like a whole ini file or writing a bunch of code and scripting to set things up, just dragging and dropping. It's worked for many years, it still works now. And also, look at what other tools and editors can adjust. Like, just look at other tools, do some research. There's a lot of adjustability that's actually out there. And think about your prioritization metrics. If all you're ever prioritizing for is like, oh, is this a blocker or not, you're going to end up with something that is technically usable, but really difficult to use. It's like, you can do it, but you got to do this, you got to do that, you got to read this documentation, you got to da-da-da. And the moment someone goes on vacation, or even worse, someone leaves the company, at that point, you're stuck. How does this thing work again? Nobody knows anymore. Like, that happens. It's really, really dangerous. So think back to that human being. When you're working with all these tools, all this tech, think back to the human being of like, how do human beings work with this? What do we adjust in our daily lives? What do we want to adjust when we're working with these things? So we can all have better tools and all work with better tools. Thank you very much.
All right.
I wanted to give a thanks to these folks for giving feedback on this presentation. It was really great. Thank you very much.
I know a few of these people.
There's also the sources that I use. So if you want to look up the sources of what I did over there. And that's it. The books that I talked about, you can find over here. So I'll get out of the way. There we go.
All right. Do we have any questions that you would like to ask Robin-Yann Storm? Okay, we have one there. There you go.
Hi. First off, thanks for the presentation. It was very interesting. We've talked a lot about UI elements and adjustable UI elements for developers. How is it with gamers? We are making a management game, which is, well, not as complicated as a game engine, for example, but also comes with a lot of different tools and hotbars and properties. How much freedom do you think we maybe should give the players? What is too much? What is enough?
The core thing in this case, always with the UX, is depends on your target audience. Like, what do your users actually do? One thing I couldn't get into this presentation because we're already on time is like, think about how much games have been adjustable lately. Also, just like the controllers and being able to set the buttons that were to be used, or going into a menu to change the hotkeys for like an FPS. Like, we've been doing that for years and years and years. That's always been working well. Like, users can take that amount of adjustment to a degree. It can be totally fine. In the case of the complexity, it's very much looking at like how many users and what kind of users do you have that need to do these things. Like in this case, I'm talking very much about AAA, big complex tools, 8+ hours a day, 4 years. In that case, you're going to have expert users all the time working with these things, and you want to have a lot of editability and adjustability for them. If you're saying like, oh, we have users that are like, I don't know, 10 years old, and they don't want to deal with a lot of complexity, you can make things simpler for them. You can make things a little bit easier to use. It depends on the target audience that you have or what kind of complexity you need. The main thing that I always say in the case of like, if you don't know your target audience or what they find complex, user testing, user testing, user testing. Making a thing, putting it in front of people, does this work well, yes or no, and going from there. Does that answer your question?
Kind of, yes, thank you.
Okay, all right, we can talk more afterwards.
Any other questions? There we go.
Thanks for the presentation. I have one question that is a bit on the side of using adjustable tools as a consumer. So I was thinking, what are your thoughts on employing that same creativity that you have in your established workflow and that you use in your creative work, and using that same thing for those established workflows? So like one day, while I was working in my IDE, I suddenly decided, why don't I just switch to Comic Sans as a font? And that actually improved my productivity a bit. So I'm wondering, like,
that's great.
Do you sometimes think like, okay, I have this established workflow, why don't I just flick something off and see if it somehow improves? Or are you very strict in that regard?
So in my case, I like to adjust things just to like see if something gets frustrating. There's the case as well of like, am I able to do the work that I need to do in the time that I need to do it, right? So in this case, you're asking specifically about me. So in my particular case, if I'm doing a thing quite often, in that case, I want to speed that workflow up. I want to make sure like, oh, I'm going to do this thing for like the next few months, this one particular thing that I'm going to be building, then I want to set things up so I can do that particular thing a lot and very fast. So that's my particular case. I want to try and go a little bit more general with this, because it's kind of like if the question is like, if users are used to work in a particular way of working, when do you tell them to adjust, or how do you tell them to adjust? In this case, it's the big depender, again, on what your target audience is. If we're talking about internal people or professionals working a very long time in a particular tool, a really good way that I've seen is like literally just like show them a video. Show them something, just even have something like a presentation for the company, kind of showcase, like, hey everyone, you're all working with this tool, we've added some new things, we now have this, we have this, we have this, like showing to them how it works, what they can do, and they can decide at that point, I don't want to use that, and that's okay. But I've noticed over the years, when you show that to people, people are going to go, oh, I had no idea. I was doing it this way the whole time. That sucked. I can do it in this way, that's great. There's also the thing that Maya does where they put little green things around anything that's new. I think is an okay way of doing it. It's definitely the case of like, don't give someone a 2 to 3 hour presentation of just like, this is all the stuff that you can do. No one's gonna watch it. It's like giving someone like 10 pages of documentation. I bet it's great documentation. Unless you're an engineer, they're not gonna read that. That's just kind of how it works. Show them a 2-minute video. Show them a GIF. Love GIFs. In the latest Photoshop, they do this really, really well. If you hover over a tool in Photoshop, little pop-up comes out, and there's a visual of how it works. Not a link to documentation. You don't have to open up your browser, nothing to read. It shows you right there in 2 seconds flat, how does that thing work? Much simpler way of seeing it. So then also I know, oh, I can do this, but I can also do that. That's great. Makes it much easier to make that thing usable for someone.
All right. This is the first time in years when I hear someone saying that Photoshop does something in a good way. All right, folks. That is it for now. Applause for Robin-Yann Storm. Thank you very much.